This story is called The Time Traveler's Advice to the Lovelorn. Gallery view. Okay, just one more second. I'm making sure. Okay, you can hear me? All right. This story was published a few months ago in Lightspeed magazine. Time is best described as the thing that must crawl by before even the most unlikely events finally get around to happening. A lot of it had passed in the little village we now visit, drifting down its cobblestone streets like loose papers carried away by the wind, before the most unlikely of all developments finally occurred. Samael, the junk collector, had fallen in love. Nobody had ever expected this, in large part because Samael was as dull and unimaginative a man who had ever lived. Some thought him simple, as no attempts to provide him with an education had ever stuck. Some thought him unfriendly, as he greeted any attempt at conversation with grunted monosyllables, hoarding what remained of a voice that years of near silence had turned to rust. There were places in the village where he was suspected of being cruel, and where children were warned to return to their homes wherever he appeared, dragging his homemade cart from place to place in search of discarded things he could fix and resell. Between that, his hulking size, and the default scowl of a man whose teeth were not pleasant for others to look at, he was considered sinister and at the bare minimum pleasant. No one in the village imagined that there could be the capacity for love anywhere in his soul, but the truth was, he was no monster, just a quiet man with scant need for other people, content with his daily routine and what little comfort that labor earned him, until he saw Magda was the watchmaker's daughter, a girl who had sometime over the course of one harsh winter, when most people had stayed indoors and only ventured out reluctantly, and in heavy furs that made everyone look alike, suddenly advanced from sweet and appealing child to something taller and rounder in all the right places. In the years that followed, she had only blossomed and was still in the process of blossoming the first time the junk collector Samael met her. She was a sweet and generous soul of precisely the sort who understood that appearance was the least reliable of all the methods human beings use to measure each other. This story could go on at great length, smothering her physical description in superlatives, or in asserting how she brightened every room she entered. It could then become a story in redemptive love, as she saw in him, which all her friends and neighbors had missed, or, for narrators of a certain bent, it could become a horror story which hinged on Samael's obsession becoming dark. However, it heads in neither of those two directions. Magda, who was every bit as wonderful as Samael believed, and was understandably the subject of wishful fantasies by many men other than the junk collector, went on to live a wholly blessed life in which the strained but never remarked upon in her youth. Before beautiful young women, not with charm, not with sheer animal magnetism, not with security, and not with sparkling repartee. He was also not the kind of man who would consider taking a young lady against her will. What he wanted was for Magda to love him not just unreservedly, but of her own free will, with none of her magnificent spark diminished or set on paths she would not travel herself. No, what he needed more than anything else was advice from someone who would neither tell him he pursued an impossible dream or laugh at him. So he went to see the time traveler. The time traveler had been an intermittent fixture of this region for centuries. First appearing as an old man when the village consisted of no more than a half dozen homes, then disappearing, reappearing every few years, sometimes older, sometimes younger, always bathed in a soft amber glow that made his full aspect comprehensible to those who lived their entire lives in only one era. Whenever he appeared, he was always adamant that he was no supernatural being, but a mere man, learned in the ways of his own far future time. Please, he said more than once over the centuries, consider me one of you. And though this was not quite possible, given the miraculous technology in his possession, he had nevertheless succeeded in rendering himself a figure regarded with more affection than fear. Sometimes, as in this century, he slowed himself down and lived as a nearly frozen figure, sitting at a table in the inn that was reserved to his use, and taking years to complete the single eye blink, speeding up and providing response only to those who asked him direct questions, which happened to be only rarely because this village respected his privacy. Once a decade or so, he would call for a refill on his drink, paying with a coin forged out of a metal so rare that just one was enough to leave the various generations of the innkeeper's family among the wealthiest in the mountains. He was thus available for Samael, who sat opposite and explained his problem. The figure behind the amber glow said, "You could try poetry." Samael regarded this prospect with something like horror. "I am no poet." "Understand, sir, it does not have to be a good poem, only a sincere one. Over the years, many ardent admirers launched dynasties with rhymes of painful scansion, using naught but the three most belabored essentials, June, moon, and spoon. In many cases, the object of affection recognized the aspirant had pitiful writing skill, but repressed her incredulous laughter out of reciprocated feeling. Others would not have recognized great poetry, even if a thick volume of it were hurled on their heads from a fifth-story window. They responded only to the sentiment. Just offer her the truth, and she will respond as her heart bids her. "But I am no good with words," Samael said. "Maybe you can help me." "You seem to think that just because I possess technology grander than your own, that I am capable of performing as an indulgent Cyrano. Forgive me, my dear man. On paper, I am a clod. And you do not want a third party to write your love letters in any event. Let me tell you a story. Many years ago, I was an idiot, not much more advanced in matters of the heart than your own unpracticed self. And I fell helplessly head over heels in love with a beautiful and charming young lady, a poet herself, in whose presence I can only admit incoherent stammers. She must have thought I was some kind of idiot, and she was not wrong in this, because it was what I became whenever she was near. Not burdened with my current experience, I traveled to 1599 and commissioned the greatest poet of all time, William Shakespeare, to produce a sonnet in her glory. I paid him a fortune in the coin of his realm, described the object of my adoration as best I could, and traveled to one evening a fortnight hence to collect what I had commissioned from him. I assure you it sounded great to me. And then I leapt forward 400 years and handed it to her. Can you guess what happened? Samael had never in his life perceived anything involving sexual politics with the perspicacity sufficient to guess what would happen next. His shrug was as eloquent as he ever got. She read it, the time traveler said, and she hated me. Why? I reckoned without the voice of the writer. Shakespeare was bawdy, sir. As a dramatist, he delighted in finding ways to insert dirty jokes, naughty puns, and out-and-out pornography wherever he could. To wake up those theatergoers whose attention spans were not quite up to multiple hours of free verse. He also enjoyed finding ways for his characters to insult each other when they were otherwise obligated to treat one another with deference and respect. So imagine if you will, a man of those inclinations engaged by a wealthy patron, one who confessed himself incapable of sculpting the metaphors capable of winning a young lady's heart. Imagine that he despised the very enterprise and wanted to warn the fair maiden off. You will understand he deeply amused himself producing lines that to this dullard's eyes appeared complimentary, but to her educated understanding of metaphor and Elizabethan slang portrayed her as a perfumed harlot who spent her days by the waterfront giving repeat customer discounts to sailors. So she slapped me across the face, called me disgusting, and flounced off while I was left rubbing my jaw and saying, ow. Samael required long minutes of cogitation to decode that speech. Well, maybe not poetry then. Trust me, Samael. You cannot get what you want from this woman without engaging her on some level. And that is precisely what renders success in this enterprise through any intermediary unlikely. Your problem is your profound personality deficit. You possess nothing capable of fascinating her. My looks, then, Samael said. You could do something about my looks. All right, I'm changing locations. Yeah. Conversational skills of an oaf, and that you lack the personality to inspire her more. And in a silence that persisted for speed, returned to dilated immobility, and ultimately said, with her love. Samael never would understand a single damn. There was a vehicle, of course, but that he was left squinting at all the oddly intersecting lines. There was a direction traveled, but it was not from a recognizable here to a definable there. It seemed to affect different parts of his body at different speeds. His head pickled in a broth of his own liver. Battalion of ardent swains, write poems to the glory of her, march off to pointless wars for the glory of her, carve masterpieces out of clay or granite or coral rock for the glory of her, trudge across deserts and cut off ears and shoot at presidents and arrange for demeaning tattoos, all for the glory of her. Then the time traveler said, we're here. Samael felt his ribcage regain the third dimension. Where's here? This is a time some 14,000 years after the era you know, when mankind has completely mastered the art of bodily modification. Here, every man and woman and every human being in the 700 genders in between, now understood to occupy those two traditional extremes, can daily modify their forms to suit whatever their needs may be. This is an era where the philtrum and the uvula are recognized as untapped reproductive organs. An era when human beings arrange to exist at the size of prions and others exist on the map as snow-capped mountain ranges. What you see when you open your eyes, dear Samael, will be unlike everything any else you've ever known, but it will also be the place that you realize is your most extravagant dreams. Samael opened his eyes, and yes, what he saw through the time machine's equivalent of a front window was a metropolis that made no sense to him. A skyline of towering glass extending as far as his eyes could see, beneath a sky the color of orange marmalade. Through the transparent walls of all those towers, he could see little black dots he understood to be the descendants of human beings going about their daily business, perhaps even working at their jobs. And yet of those who were closer, some had a wholly horrifying number of limbs or heads, and some seemed to be, for lack of a better phrase, on fire. And behind them all were figures who towered over the tallest buildings. He gulped and said, "What do we do?" The time traveler said, "I will take you to a certain clinic I know about, where more exotic requests can be accommodated. You will be improved and rendered capable of winning Magda's devotion. I will bring you back and you will live happily ever after. I guarantee you this, Samael, and I want you to know that I am wholly sincere about this, that you are a good man, utterly deserving of these ambitions." The junk collector said, "Thanks." And then he wept, because he had never really known kindness. After a moment, he succumbed to the fear impulse. Will it hurt? It's love, Samael. Of course it will. That's much of the reason people want it. And Samael smiled, because even a shambling clod like himself could see the truth in this. And with no further hesitation, he let the time traveler lead him to his destiny, all for the love of her. And of the resolution to this story, I can only tell you that the time traveler brought him back to Magda, who fell in love with him in mere seconds, and that she took him to her bed and cherished him to the end of his days. His life was short, only the 15 years that had been promised, but it was 15 years of pure bliss. To most people of the town, the junk dealer they had known never returned and was never missed, remarked upon only by those incapable of letting things like an unsolved disappearance just be. But before that happened, the time traveler left the tavern that generations of villagers had come to know as his home, for the first time since some of the oldest people in town had first blinked at the phenomenon known as light. His stride, known so rarely in the past decades, was jovial. He was a good man, this time traveler. He had a genuine affection for people in general, and in specific for the inhabitants of this one small village, who he had kept safe from the churning of world politics, from economic busts, from the tramp of conquering armies, and from all the other ills that beset less protected men. He knew they were provincial, but he found their conservative ways a fine curative for the surfeit that is the lot of the traveler. He would have done anything for them, anything reasonable. And what he had done for Samael was not just reasonable, but wise. So he made his way to the watchmaker's home, and he knocked on the door. 3 short raps, neither angry or threatening. And in a couple of seconds, the door was opened by a vision of extraordinary beauty, fresh-faced and sweet, and with a smile capable of illuminating the world. The time traveler was millennia too old for her, but he felt as instantly in love with her at that moment as Samael had been. And he thought, this at last is why I love mankind. "Hello," Magda said. "Hello," the time traveler said. "An admirer of yours has asked me to bring you a gift." He reached to his coat which had many big and expansive pockets, and handed her a sleepy 8-week-old beagle. The end.